ACT, English sentence structure. To compare two similar actions, you can use the form as, insert an adverb, and then use as again. So say, for example, the faucet drips slowly. Now, you want to give your reader a better idea of how slowly the faucet actually drips. So you can compare it to the dripping of molasses, which your reader probably knows is very slow. So you can use this form right here by saying the faucet drips as slowly as molasses. So you use as, you insert an adverb, and then you use as again. So now the reader has a better idea of how slowly the faucet actually drips. Now here it says strangers are treated as well as friends by Tim. So people can assume that Tim is going to treat his friends well. But people don't know how well he treats his strangers. So instead of just saying strangers are treated well by Tim, the writer can put strangers are treated as well as friends by Tim. So the writer is comparing two similar actions now. The action of him treating strangers and the action of him treating friends to show that Tim treats strangers very well. One final example is he never managed as successfully as his brother did. So here again we're comparing two similar actions. Apparently he managed something very successfully, and then his brother also managed. And so we're comparing how each of the brothers managed so we can see who managed better. So that's an example of adverb equal comparisons. ACT, English sentence structure. Adverbs can be used to compare and contrast dissimilar actions. So the comparative form of a word is used to compare two actions, and the superlative form of a word is used to refer to one in a group of three or more that is the outstanding example of the action. So when we're dealing with one-syllable adverbs, we use the suffix er or est, or we use the words less or least. So say we have the word late. To get to the comparative form of the word late, we just add the suffix er to make it later. So if we have two people and one person is late by an hour and the other person is late by 2 hours, we would refer to the person late by 2 hours as being the later one. And then if we have three or more people and one person is late by 3 hours, we would refer to them as being the latest person. So that's the superlative form, latest. So we're just adding these suffixes, and really in later we're just adding r, and in latest we're just adding st because we already had e from late. Now to look at this in a more negative sense, you could use the words less or least. So you could refer to one person as being less late and another person as being the least late. Now, when you have an adverb with two or more syllables, you don't use a suffix anymore. You just use the words more or most or less or least. So we have the word carefully, and if two people both do something carefully, you would say that one person did it more carefully. And you could also say that one person did it less carefully, depending on how you want to look at it. And then also with the superlative form, if you have three or more, you would refer to one person as doing it the most carefully. And then you could refer to the person who wasn't very careful as being doing something the least carefully. Now we do have something called irregular adverbs, and what I mean by irregular is that they're irregular in the way you form the comparative and superlative forms of the adverb. So for example, we have the word well. Now the comparative form of the word well is better, and the superlative form is the best. So as you can see, better and best aren't in any way close to the word well. And so you just have to be familiar with these irregular adverbs and be familiar with how to form the comparative and superlative forms of those words. So again, adverbs can be used to compare and contrast dissimilar actions. And we use the comparative form when we're comparing two actions, and we use the superlative form when we're comparing three or more actions.
Common comma functions. Commas have many different functions, but their three primary functions are to separate clauses, join independent clauses and they're used to avoid confusion. So since we talked about separating and joining clauses, let's first talk about what a clause is. A clause is a piece of a sentence. If you have a dependent clause, it is dependent on the rest of the sentence. It cannot stand alone as a complete sentence. It would be a fragment. If you have an independent clause, it would be able to stand alone as a sentence. It would be independently a sentence on its own. So dependent clause can't be a sentence by itself, depends on the rest of the sentence. Independent clause stands alone, can be a sentence all by itself. So let's look at how we can separate clauses with commas. You will use a comma to separate a dependent introductory clause from an independent clause. So one way that dependent clauses are used is as an introduction to a sentence. For instance, before the game, Jimmy ate a healthy breakfast. We use this comma to separate the dependent clause. So before the game is dependent. You cannot say before the game all by itself and have it be a complete sentence. It's only a prepositional phrase. So it is a dependent clause. But then you have Jimmy ate a healthy breakfast. This would be independent. It could stand all by itself. So we are separating the dependent introductory clause from the independent clause. Before the game, Jimmy ate a healthy breakfast. And you notice how you pause where that comma is. And a lot of times, that's why a comma is there, to get you to pause so that your sentence makes sense as you're reading it, either to yourself in a book or aloud to someone else. So, dependent clause as an introduction needs a comma. Now, let's look at if we kind of switch the order of the sentence up. Jimmy ate a healthy breakfast before the game. When we put before the game at the end of the sentence, we don't need to have that comma anymore. We only needed the comma whenever we wanted to pause to let people know that before the game was separate and to realize the action was happening after that. So Jimmy ate a healthy breakfast before the game. Here, we didn't actually have to put a comma because the independent clause came first. So we had our dependent clause at the end, no comma needed. Now this is in this situation. That doesn't mean there will never be a situation where you will have a dependent clause at the end that needs a comma. If you have several items in a series, you may still need a comma toward the end of the sentence. But if you're using an introductory phrase, if it comes at the beginning of the sentence, you need the comma. If it comes at the end of a sentence, generally you won't. Let's look at another way that we use commas to separate clauses. You will use a comma to separate two independent clauses joined by any of the following conjunctions. And a conjunction is basically a connector word. And, but, or, for, nor, so, and yet are common conjunctions. If you have two independent clauses, that means two phrases in a sentence that could stand as a sentence on their own, and they're connected by one of these conjunctions, then you will need a comma to separate those two. We are going to the movies, or we are going to a nice restaurant. So here's our conjunction, or. We are going to the movies is an independent clause. We are going to a nice restaurant is an independent clause. So the comma is needed to separate two independent clauses. Now, let's look at if we combine this sentence a different way. We are going to the movies or to a nice restaurant. Here, we have that or, which would be a conjunction, but let's look. We are going to the movies is an independent clause. To a nice restaurant is dependent. To a nice restaurant cannot stand by itself. We don't have a subject in that clause. In this version of the sentence, we had we are going still included. So we still had a subject and a verb, so this was a complete thought all by itself. So it was an independent clause. It could stand as a sentence. To a nice restaurant is missing that. It's missing both your subject and your verb. It's not been made a complete sentence, so it's dependent on the rest of the sentence to make sense. So in this instance, we did not have two independent clauses. So, no comma was needed. Okay, now let's look at the second primary function of a comma. To join independent clauses, to avoid short, choppy sentences. So generally, whenever we are going to join independent clauses, we're doing it so that we don't have a series of short, choppy sentences. Now you're going to see that this might look a little similar to where we separated independent clauses. Sarah plays softball and Sarah enjoys swimming. Okay, and this one we had an independent clause, or a conjunction, and an independent clause. Let's look at the next version of this set of clauses. Sarah plays softball, runs track, and enjoys swimming. So Sarah plays softball. This is independent. Runs track is dependent. We have our conjunction, and enjoys swimming is dependent. Yet we still had those commas. And then let's look at the last version. Sarah plays softball, Sarah runs track, Sarah enjoys swimming. So all three of these are going to be independent clauses because they are complete sentences. But they're short, choppy sentences. Sarah plays softball, Sarah runs track, Sarah enjoys swimming. We keep hearing Sarah over and over, and these sentences are short. We can combine them to make it a smoother flowing sentence. So you could have two independent clauses joined by a conjunction like we did up here, and then you would use that comma to separate them. But you are still joining multiple sentences when you do that. So you're using those commas to separate the clauses, but you are using them to also join two sentences into one. So Sarah plays softball and Sarah enjoys swimming. So here we used our comma to join these two independent thoughts. Sarah plays softball, runs track, and enjoys swimming. Well, we had dependent clauses here, but we still had a conjunction. The reason we're going to put commas here is because you've got three or more items in a series. If you list three or more items or clauses, activities in a series, you're going to separate them with commas. So the reason we're using it here is to separate three or more items in a series. Here we were using it to separate two independent clauses. And then at the end we had no commas. We just had three complete sentences, which basically equaled three independent clauses. So we had to find ways to combine them. So we could combine all three into one sentence, and we could use our rule of using 3 or more commas in a series to join these different independent clauses. Or we could use our rule of separating 2 independent clauses with a comma and a conjunction and keep 2 independent clauses instead of separating it up and making it dependent clauses, but 3 different activities in a series. We could say Sarah collects bananas, apples, and tomatoes. We would have to put commas in that series too. Sarah collects bananas, comma, tomatoes, comma, and apples. So when you have 3 or more items in a series, you have to put your commas to separate them. This is going to be helpful when you're combining different ideas to be able to join independent clauses and in other instances. If you have just 2 sentences that you would like to combine, you can do so using a conjunction and a comma. As long as it's still an independent clause on each side, you will need that comma. Let's look at the third primary function of a comma. They are used to avoid confusion. I want to eat chicken, broccoli, and corn for dinner. Without a comma in this sentence, it sounds like you're saying you want to eat chicken broccoli. Well, you probably don't know what chicken broccoli is, and that's because it's not a real food. What would make more sense is if we said I want to eat chicken, comma, broccoli, comma, and corn for dinner. Then you would be telling someone you would like to eat chicken, broccoli, and corn. 3 items, not chicken broccoli, which makes chicken look like an adjective to broccoli. Now, this comma here in a series, if you have 3 or more items, the comma immediately before and is optional. Some people like the way it looks, some don't. I like the way the comma looks. It helps me feel more organized when I'm writing, so I always put it in. But you definitely need this comma because otherwise the meaning of your sentence is unclear and you would not be avoiding that confusion that commas are supposed to help you avoid. Let's look at the next example. Before we eat, our dog has to eat. This doesn't make sense. Before we eat our dog. You're not going to eat your dog. But if you're reading this sentence quickly, without a comma there to slow you down and make you pause, you don't read it correctly. You would have to read it a second or third time to get what the author's meaning actually was. So you would say, before we eat, our dog has to eat. And maybe this is so that your dog isn't going to bother you while you eat. If your dog's already eaten, then you can eat happily. So before we eat, our dog has to eat. And this is one of those dependent introductory clauses like we talked about up here. We use a comma to separate clauses, and that can also avoid confusion. So you see how some of these rules tie in together. Commas in a series, commas in a series. Introductory clause being separated from the independent clause that is the rest of the sentence. Dependent clause separated from independent clause. So a lot of the rules of commas may overlap a little bit, but these are 3 of the primary functions you're going to see commas used for. That doesn't mean you won't see them used any other way. They're also used geographically if you're talking about a city inside of a country or inside of a state. If you're talking about dates or times, then you may also use commas. Commas are used in people's names sometimes if you're putting a junior or a senior. So these aren't the only times you're going to see commas, but in writing, these are the primary functions in which you are going to see commas used.
Many times in your writing, you will find that you have 2 short sentences that can be combined together. Now, in order to combine 2 sentences, they need to have the same subject matter. In other words, they need to be about the same things. You wouldn't want to have one sentence that's talking about a baseball game and another sentence that's talking about mowing the lawn connected together into one sentence. So the sentences need to be similar. So this first sentence says Joey will be at the park, and the second one says if he is not at the park, then he is doing homework. So these sentences are fine as they are, but we can combine them together because they're somewhat short and they're also talking about the same thing. So we have 4 different ways that we can combine these sentences. So let's take a look at A. Joey will be at the park and he will be doing homework. Now, the sentence is well put together. However, it changes the meaning of these first 2 sentences because up here it's saying Joey will be at the park, and if he's not at the park, then he's going to be doing homework. So he's either going to be at the park or he's going to be doing homework. It's one or the other. Here, this is saying that he will do both. So we know that's wrong. We go to B. Joey will be at the park before he does homework. We don't see that either because, again, this is saying that Joey's going to go to the park and do homework, and he's just going to do one or the other. We go to C. Joey will be at the park if he does homework. No, these two sentences don't say anything about him doing both. This is saying that he will be at the park if he gets his homework done. But remember, this up here indicates that it's an either-or situation. He's either going to be at the park or he's going to be doing homework. So we get to D. Joey will be at the park or he will be doing homework. This sentence right here combines these two sentences very well. It makes the two sentences mesh together very well into one sentence. That way, the reader only has to read one sentence instead of two, and it does not change the meaning of the first two sentences. That's key. You never want to change the meaning when you combine two sentences. ACT English sentence structure. Conjunctions join words, phrases, and clauses, showing the relationship between them. So conjunctions join words, phrases, and clauses, and in addition, they show the relationship between these words, phrases, and clauses. And so there's some categories of conjunctions, including coordinating, correlative, and subordinating. And then there's conjunctive adverbs or transition words, which are another type of conjunction. But right now, we just want to focus on two of the main types of conjunctions, which are coordinating and correlative. And so these have similar definitions. The first is that they join grammatically equal words, phrases, or clauses. And so when we're talking about words, phrases, or clauses, we can be talking about two pronouns, two prepositional phrases, or two independent clauses, etc. And so those pronouns, prepositional phrases, or independent clauses are just being joined by coordinating conjunctions. And some examples of coordinating conjunctions are and, but, or, as well as nor. And then we have correlative conjunctions, which are used in pairs to join two or more words, phrases, or clauses that are grammatically equal. So you may be thinking that this is the same definition as we just looked at. Well, we still are talking about grammatically equal words, phrases, or clauses, but this time we're talking about them being used in pairs. So some examples of correlative conjunctions are both paired with and, not only, paired with but also, and then either paired with or. So notice each time I have 3 dots in between the two conjunctions. And so what that is signifying is that you have a conjunction, then you have words in between it, and then another conjunction. And so when we talk about joining 2 or more words, phrases, or clauses, again, we can be talking about pronouns, prepositional phrases, independent clauses. So say, for example, you have 2 independent clauses. You could say both, then you put 1 independent clauses, and then you put and write another independent clause. And so you're using these conjunctions to join these 2 phrases, clauses, or words together. Whenever you write anything, whether that's just a sentence, a paragraph, or a whole story, you always want to go back and edit what you have written. And so the process of editing is where you read everything that you have written down and you make sure that it's correct. When there's mistakes in your writing, oftentimes the audience will pay more attention to your mistakes than the information you're trying to convey to them. In addition, if your mistakes are too bad, it will make it where the reader cannot understand what you were trying to say. So let's take a look at this example paragraph and see what needs editing. The first sentence says, Andrew planted a tree. It was a sunny day. What we have here is a run-on sentence. That's 2 sentences that are just connected together in an incorrect way. So this first phrase, Andrew planted a tree, has a subject and a verb, so it's a whole sentence. And the second phrase says, it was a sunny day, so we have the subject, it, and the verb was. So these are 2 sentences that are joined together incorrectly. So a run-on sentence is a sentence that just goes on too long. So there's a number of ways that we can correct this. We could put comma and. So the sentence would read, Andrew planted a tree and it was a sunny day. Or we could put a period here and make it capitalized, and we can say Andrew planted a tree, it was a sunny day. Those are correct. But I think what the best way to do this is to get rid of the period, get rid of it and was, and put the word on. So now it reads, Andrew planted a tree on a sunny day. So that's just one sentence, and that's correct. The next sentence says, first he got a shovel and the tree. Whenever you read a phrase at the beginning of a sentence, like first, it needs a comma in front of it, because a comma tells the reader to pause. So now the reader will read this sentence like, first, he got a shovel and the tree. The next sentence says he dug a hole, will plant the tree, and watered it. So the problem with this sentence has to do with verb tenses. So we see the verb dug right here. This is what we call past tense, because it happened in the past. He dug a hole. That indicates that he dug the hole yesterday or maybe a week ago. And then in this last phrase it says he watered it. That's also in the past tense. It's indicating that he watered the tree maybe yesterday or the week before. But we get to this phrase which says he will plant the tree. Will plant is future tense. This sounds like he's going to plant the tree in the future, but we know that he already has planted the tree. So we need to change the words will and plant to the verb planted. Now all the verbs are in past tense, so this sentence has what we would call consistency. He dug a hole, planted the tree, and watered it. Now the last sentence says a pine tree is what he planted. This sentence is clear. You can understand what the author is trying to convey to you. However, it could be worded in a better way. So we could say, he planted a pine tree. So these two sentences are saying basically the same thing, but this new sentence sounds better than this first sentence. So again, the process of editing is reading everything that you have written, and a lot of times it helps if you read everything out loud and you find any mistakes that you have made, and then you correct those mistakes. It is important to capitalize certain words according to grammar rules, because when you don't follow grammar rules and you capitalize a word you shouldn't, or you don't capitalize a word that you should, it becomes distracting to the reader because they may know that specific grammar rule. And capitalizing certain words helps the reader follow along with your train of thought, because it may help them realize when a sentence is beginning or when you're talking about a person's name. So we're going to look at this passage and identify the capitalization errors. So starting out, we're looking good. Then we go to the word January, and we see the J right there. The J is small, and it should be big. So that's one thing we should capitalize, months. Then we continue on to which was a Friday, and we find that the F isn't capitalized. So I'm going to write days. So you don't capitalize the word days, and you don't capitalize the word months, but you do capitalize months of the year, like January, February, December. You capitalize days of the week, like Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. And then it says we went to the Museum of Science on a class trip. So museum and science both need to be capitalized because this is a specific place. You don't capitalize of because it's not an important word. So you need to capitalize museum and science. And then notice right here, class does not need to be capitalized because there's no reason why it needs to be capitalized. Now we go to this sentence, and the is not capitalized, even though it's the first letter of the first word of a sentence. So we need to capitalize the first word of a sentence. The class took a bus to the museum. Now you may be thinking that museum needs to be capitalized here as well because we capitalize it over here. But here we're talking about the Museum of Science. It's a specific museum. Here we're just talking about a museum in general, so it's not capitalized. It was a lot of fun. That sentence looks good. My teacher, Mrs. Jones, and some parents came with us. Now the first word of the sentence is capitalized, which is good. Jones is capitalized, which is the last name. We always capitalize last names. But then Mrs. isn't capitalized. And so you need to capitalize abbreviations before names. abbreviations before names. And so those can be things like Dr., Mr., Ms., Mrs., all those abbreviations need to be capitalized. And so those are some examples of words that do need to be capitalized, but there are many other grammar rules out there, but those are some common words that are accidentally capitalized or accidentally not capitalized. When writing, it's important to have consistency in your use of punctuation. So you never want to alternate punctuation. So say you start a phrase with a comma, you wouldn't want to end it with a dash. Now it's also important to use these types of punctuation in pairs, like such as dashes, parentheses, or commas. You always want to use those in pairs because if a section of text has an opening dash, parentheses, or comma at the beginning of a phrase, then there should be a matching closing dash, parentheses, or comma at the end of the phrase. So we're going to take a look at some examples of the use of dashes, commas, and parentheses. So you always want to use parentheses in pairs. So here we see the sentence, after removing the fence, wear gloves, feed the pigs. So notice we have parentheses here and here. We wouldn't just use one by itself, or we wouldn't use parentheses here and a dash or a comma over here. The reason we have a comma here has nothing to do with the parentheses. It's just because we need to put a comma after this phrase, after removing the fence. So we always use parentheses in pairs. Now, we also always use dashes in pairs. Now, say we had two words like long-term projects. Here we would hyphenate long-term and put a hyphen right there. So a hyphen is different than a dash, but to us they often look the same and we kind of get them confused. So right, with a hyphen, you're just going to use it by itself there. But with a dash, you're always using it in pairs. But I just wanted to point that out so I didn't confuse you. So here we have the sentence, the two guys wearing hats, Brian and Andrew, play football. So we have a dash here, setting off Brian and Andrew, and then we have another dash to end it. And then with use of commas, sometimes we need to use them in pairs. As a general rule, we do use them in pairs. So like after the game we went to eat, notice we only have one comma. But let's go ahead and look at this sentence. My friend, the guy in the green shirt, plays baseball. And I need a period right there. So right here we see a comma, and we see another comma, because it's setting off this phrase right here. So we need two commas, because commas often set off certain phrases that don't have to be there, because we could just say, my friend plays baseball. But we use two commas here. Now the reason we only use one is because technically the other comma would go before after, because we could just say we went to eat, but we're adding in after the game. But it would be silly to put a comma at the beginning of a sentence. It works the same way if this sentence was reversed. If we said we went to eat after the game, we'd put a comma before after, and we just put a period after game instead of another comma. So usually you're going to use it in pairs, but there are exceptions. Then many times you use commas for items in a series, like I enjoy playing basketball, baseball, football, and soccer. I'd put a comma after all of those different sports. Well, in that case, I would only end up with 3 commas instead of 4. And so that's an odd number. So they're not always going to be used in pairs when you use them for items in a series. So again, make sure you don't alternate punctuation, and make sure that if you're using dashes, parentheses, or commas, that you have the punctuation to open up the phrase, and you have the punctuation there to also close the phrase.
Drafting a thesis statement. The thesis statement expresses the main idea of a composition. It should encompass every idea, detail, and argument in that one thesis statement. It should all relate in some way to the thesis. So your thesis isn't going to list out all of your arguments and details that you're going to have in your composition, but it should relate in some way to all of them. A thesis can be kind of tricky because you want it to be general enough to encompass everything that's going to be in your paper, but specific enough that the reader knows what your main idea is. It should be a short declarative statement, but it should not be vague. It needs to be specific. It can't just be a general subjective sentence that doesn't really tell the reader what's going on. The thesis statement should suggest the content of the rest of the piece so the audience knows what to expect. And if you're too vague, the audience isn't going to know what to expect. So you have to be specific without being too specific, and general without being too general. So I'll give you a few examples so you can see how to balance these things and draft an effective thesis statement. The principal is basically a nice guy. It tells you the principal's nice, but there are lots of things you could talk about that would make the principal a nice guy. This is a pretty vague statement, so let's improve upon that. Let's get more specific and give the reader more of an idea of what the content of your piece is going to be. The principal's policies demonstrate his care for students. So now, the reason we think he's a nice guy is because it's obvious that he cares for his students based on his policies. So we're not talking about the principal being a nice guy because he coaches Little League or he just says hi to you in the hallway. It's because he has policies at school that show that he cares about his students. So this is an effective thesis statement. This is a good one. This one is too vague. We had to get more specific. So let's look at another example. Dogs are good pets. Well, not everyone's going to think that, but at least if you give them more information, they may see your side of things. Saying dogs are good pets is still really vague. You need to get more specific. Why do you think they're good pets? But don't get too specific because you want your main idea to be in your thesis statement, but you don't want all the supporting details to be there. You want to save those for the body of your paper. So let's look at this as this is an effective thesis statement example. Changing dogs are good pets, which is still too vague, to something more effective. Because of its sense of loyalty, its ability to be trained, and its good companionship, a dog is the perfect pet for me. Now, this thesis does actually tell you what your main subtopics are probably going to be. You'll probably have a body paragraph talking about a dog's sense of loyalty, another one about how easy they are to train, and another one about how they are good companions. This kind of thesis statement is also okay because it gets specific, but not too specific. It tells what your subtopics are going to be, what your supporting overall ideas are going to be, but it doesn't get into every detail and argument that you're going to present in your composition. So this would be another good example. So one of the main things to remember when writing your thesis statement is to include the main idea of your paper. Let the reader understand what they should expect from the rest of your paper, but don't be too vague or too specific. Try to focus on a short declarative statement that tells the overall idea of your paper without giving it all away. Drafting body paragraphs. Body paragraphs should follow the thesis statement of a composition. And this is both in the order they are written and that all the body paragraphs are going to support the thesis statement. You want to supply supporting ideas, details, and arguments in your body paragraphs. And many writers choose to start with the body paragraphs. And this is because they know what they want to write about, or they at least have some ideas, but maybe they don't have their thesis in mind yet. They haven't refined a thesis statement yet. So many writers will write out all of the body paragraphs first. They'll get their ideas down on paper and develop a thesis statement from that, which works out perfectly because your body paragraphs are supposed to follow and support the thesis, and the thesis statement is supposed to encompass all of your body paragraphs. Each paragraph that is a body paragraph should express a single supporting idea. You shouldn't have multiple supporting ideas in one paragraph. Pick a main supporting idea and then give more details about that one. Back up that one single supporting idea within that body paragraph. Usually, you will find the supporting idea at the beginning of the paragraph. The writer will let you know right away what their supporting idea is that they're presenting in that body paragraph. Now, sometimes the writer will save it for the end of the paragraph as a dramatic gesture, or it might be in the second sentence if the first sentence was used as a transition between body paragraphs. But usually, you'll find your single supporting idea spelled out for you in the beginning of a paragraph. However, all sentences in the body paragraph should support both the main idea of that paragraph and the thesis statement of the essay as a whole. So whenever you're writing your body paragraphs, every sentence should still be supporting that main idea, that single supporting idea of the paragraph, and it should be backing up your thesis statement. Now, your thesis statement was supposed to be broad enough to encompass everything that you're going to write about, so your body paragraphs should be able to support your thesis statement without specifically restating it. And each body paragraph should not repeat the thesis statement. You don't want to repeat your thesis statement over and over throughout your paper. What you want to do is state your thesis statement in the introductory paragraph. All your body paragraphs should be supporting that thesis with details. And then in your conclusion, you don't want to repeat the thesis statement, but you want to echo it. You want to give your readers a final reminder of what it was that you were writing about, what your main idea was. So the thesis should simply be developed, expanded, and refined in the body paragraphs. The body paragraphs are simply there to be that. They're the body of the essay. They're the meat of it. That's where you're getting all your details from. The thesis tells you what you're going to be writing about. The body paragraph is where you're actually writing it. You're giving all those details. So most of your information is going to be found in your body paragraphs. So just remember, when you're drafting body paragraphs, get your supporting ideas in there, but stick to one single supporting idea per paragraph and make sure that every supporting idea is supporting that main thesis statement. Drafting conclusions. Many writers found the conclusion the most difficult part of the essay to compose because there's this expectation that it has to be profound or inspiring, something magical. But it doesn't have to be all that. It should avoid simply restating the thesis statement. You don't want to hear the same sentence again that you heard in your introductory paragraph. But it should suggest some ideas or questions that were raised by the preceding text. Maybe your conclusion brings up a different idea that could be elaborated on for a future essay, or a question that really makes the reader think about what they've just read. A good conclusion will remind the reader of the thesis, remind them of the thesis without restating it by providing some applications, questions, or possible counter-arguments. So the writer may tell you how you can use this information in the future. What application does it have for your life? They could pose an interesting question that makes you really think about what you just read, or a counter-argument. Perhaps they say, well, maybe I'm not really right after all. Maybe it's this way. And then that really throws you for a loop because you've just read their whole paper that supports their thesis, and now they're saying, well, maybe not. So that would really leave a lasting impression on you, I think, because you've just read this whole paper about one topic and they're telling you, oh, but maybe it's this way, which leaves you open to questioning it, thinking about it, and maybe you want to go do some research yourself after that. A good conclusion should indicate how the reader should think about this subject in the future. So maybe it doesn't change your mind about a particular issue completely, But whenever this issue comes up later, this essay should come to mind. You should think about, oh, I remember I read that one thing in that essay and it really struck home with me and I remember that now. Or, well, I didn't know about this before, but after reading this essay, I know about this one thing and it affects the way I feel about the issue. The conclusion should be memorable. So we talked about how it doesn't have to be super inspiring, but it should be memorable because it's the final impression that your reader is left with. It's the last thing they're going to read before they're done reading your composition. So you want it to be memorable. So here are 3 different ways that you might do that without making it some awe-inspiring work. Many writers save a fascinating detail, an anecdote or short story, or a quote for the end of their paper. So your conclusion could have some fascinating detail. Maybe you saved one thing that you found in your research that you thought was really cool and it supports your thesis statement really well and you saved it for the conclusion because you want your reader to remember that detail. Or maybe you found a little story or thought up a little story that would support your thesis and you include that. Or maybe there's a famous quote out there. Hearing or reading a famous name makes you think, oh, they said something that supports their thesis. Ooh, let me read that and remember that. Let me think about that again. So these are 3 tricks that you can put in your bag for helping you compose a successful conclusion, one that will be memorable and leave a final impression on your reader. When you're drafting conclusions, don't stress about making it this magical, inspirational thing. You might succeed. You might get a magical, inspirational conclusion, but not all of them are going to be that flowery. They're not all going to work out that way. They may just support your thesis statement without restating it and let the reader know how they should think about this subject in the future. You want to leave a lasting impression, and 3 ways to do that would be with a fascinating detail, an anecdote, or a quote. So I would definitely remember these 3 tricks to keep in your bag.
Coherence is very important when writing. The reader has to be able to understand what is being written. Because you as a writer may be writing a rough draft, or you might call it drafting ideas on a particular subject. So you're taking ideas and putting them in written form. And so your job as the writer is to try to communicate ideas to the reader. And so you want to be able to do that as clearly and effectively as possible. So you want to make sure your ideas are clear and easy to understand. So you want to make sure your ideas are both clear and easy to understand. So if you wrote a paper and then a reader read it and said, what does that mean? If a reader asks, what does that mean? It means that the writer did not succeed in getting the point across. So that means you need to make your ideas more clear and easy to understand, because you don't want a reader to have to ask that question, what does that mean? Now, ideas need to progress in a natural order. Because if your ideas don't progress in a natural order, then a reader will have to jump around your paper. They may have to go back and reread sections to get the meaning. So you want a natural flow in your paper. You want a beginning, or someone call that an introduction. You want a middle, or someone call that the body of the paper. And then you want an end. And another word for that would be conclusion, a beginning, middle, and end, or an introduction, body, and conclusion. And so you want your ideas to progress as you go throughout the paper. The third thing you need to do when writing is have supporting details. So in other words, your opinions are not enough. So say that you said a dog is my favorite animal. And you even put an exclamation point because you're so excited about a dog being your favorite animal. That's not enough because that's just your opinion. So you can put a couple points or supporting details as to why a dog is your favorite animal. So one maybe is that dogs are friendly. Maybe you have a real friendly dog. And another point could be that they like to play. And so now not only are you saying a dog is my favorite animal, you're saying why in your paper. So you can say a dog is my favorite animal. A couple of the reasons a dog is my favorite animal is because they are very friendly. Another reason is that dogs love to play, and I like to play with them. And then now not only do you have a particular opinion, but you also have supporting details to go along with it, so your ideas are more believable. So those are the three main ideas you need to stick with when you're drafting ideas, or when you're writing a rough draft. You need to make sure that your writing is clear and easy to understand. You need to make sure that your writing progresses in a natural order, and make sure that you have supporting details. Sometimes after reading a piece of text, someone can come up with what's called a written response to literature. And so this is one's response or reaction to a certain piece of text. So this is when someone gives constructive criticism to the author of the piece of text. They're giving feedback to the author. So this can be a very good thing, but there's several elements that are very key to include. So there's some things they need to include, and there's a couple of connections they need to make. So first, they need to include their background knowledge. Their background knowledge on the subject at hand. And this gives them credibility because it shows that they know what they're talking about. And a couple of connections they need to make is they need to make connections to things that have happened in their own life and connections to other texts that they may have read. So this also helps establish credibility by showing they know what they're talking about, because they must really understand the piece of text if they've experienced the same types of things in their own life, or if they've read other pieces of text talking about the same thing. So that all establishes credibility. But the really important part of this is that you need to talk about what the piece of text makes them think and feel. So as they talk about what it makes them think and feel, then that's really the key part of this written response, because a written response includes one's response or reaction. It's basically their reaction to this text, what they thought about it. Now there's a couple of other things they can include, which can be very helpful, which can be ways they agree or disagree with the author, and then also any questions they have for the author. Now, it's important that when the writer of this written response talks about what it makes them think and feel, ways they agree or disagree, and questions they have, it's important that they use textual evidence, that they use specific evidence for the text. And so usually this is going to come in the form of direct quotes. Because when they use this direct evidence, these direct quotes from the text, they can then support and then strengthen their response. If they never actually quote the article, then their arguments are going to seem somewhat vague. But if they can include exactly what the author said, then build a strong argument, then people are more likely to believe them. And if they have strong credentials, like lots of background knowledge, lots of connections to their own life, if they make a strong case about other texts they have read that are similar to this piece of text, if they have that strong credibility, then people are more likely to believe what they say, and then even more so if they're able to build a strong argument. An introduction is a vital part of a paper because it sets the tone for the rest of the paper, and oftentimes a reader will decide to read past the introduction only if the introduction is well written. So it's very important that you put some thought and effort into the introduction. So there's two things an introduction needs to include, and there's many things an introduction should not include. So first, the things an introduction should include. 1, a thesis statement. And 2, an attention getter. So a thesis statement briefly tells what the paper is going to be about. Now, you're not going to structure your thesis statement by saying, I'm going to tell you about, or my paper will explain this. It's more of a general concept or a general argument that the entire paper is going to refer back to. So every concept and idea in the paper is going to fall under the umbrella of the thesis statement and relate back to it. The thesis statement generally comes at the end of the introductory paragraph. It'll be a sentence or two, but it needs to come at the end of the paragraph. Don't start at the beginning of the paragraph, because the beginning of the paragraph needs to have the attention getter. And the thesis statement is the attention getter. The attention getter, like it sounds, gets the reader's attention and then leads up to the thesis statement, which tells what the paper is going to be about, or the general concept the paper will be talking about. So what makes a good attention getter? Many times this can be a surprising fact, something that will surprise the reader, making them want to read more. Sometimes telling an interesting fact about some well-known person, or telling a quick story, maybe a personal story, or maybe a personal story about someone famous. All those are good ways to start off a paper. Sometimes giving a little bit of background information, but don't make this like a textbook. Make it really interesting and come alive for the reader. So that keeps the reader reading, and that leads up to the thesis statement, which is to come. So that's the main two things that need to be in the introduction. Watch out for anything else that would get in the way of having an attention getter and a thesis statement, because that's all you really need in the first paragraph. Anything else will get in the way and slow down the action. A comma is there for the purpose of breaking the flow of text. So basically, we could define the job of commas as to break the flow of text. So commas should come in places in sentences where we would naturally pause if we were speaking that sentence. And so one way to test whether or not a comma is necessary is to pause very deliberately at each comma when reading. Because it's important not to overuse commas, because they lose their effect if they're used in places that they should not be. So it's important to know when commas are needed and when they're not needed, both for your own writing and maybe if you're revising someone else's work. So let's practice. Right here we have a sentence that says, as you can see, the car is very old. But we have a comma right here. So if you're just reading this to yourself inside your head, you may have trouble determining whether or not the comma is needed. So try reading it out loud and deliberately stopping at the comma. As you can see, the car is very old. Well, that makes sense, because if you were speaking this, you would be explaining to someone and you would say, as you can see, the car is very old. So the comma there is needed. Another example is this sentence right here. Natural disasters, such as tornadoes, hurricanes, and earthquakes, are not very common here. So here we have 3 commas. We actually have 4 commas. And so 2 of these commas are there for the purpose of setting off this phrase, and the other 2 commas are there because we're making a list. So first, let's take a look at the phrase. Natural disasters, such as tornadoes, hurricanes, and earthquakes, are not very common here. So really, we could omit everything in between these 2 commas and just say natural disasters are not very common here. So that's why we're using commas here, because we could set this off. But if you were speaking this, you would say natural disasters, such as tornadoes, hurricanes, and earthquakes, are not very common here. So both of those commas are needed. Now, when you're reading the list, such as tornadoes, hurricanes, and earthquakes, you don't really need to pause in between each item in the list. But here the commas aren't here as much to break the flow of text. In this case, they're just distinguishing between the different items in the list. So this is kind of an exception of when you wouldn't follow the rules of commas are only there to break the flow of text. But in general, hopefully you can see kind of a better idea of when to use commas. So where the check marks are, those were all the correct places to use commas, and then right there and right there as well. You just want to make sure that you use commas when you need them, and if in doubt, then generally leave the comma. But many times you want to leave out commas when you can, because they slow down your writing, because someone feels like they need to mentally pause. If they're speaking, they need to actually pause when reading that comma. And so make sure your comma usage is appropriate.
Order of sections of a draft. When you're writing, you may think everything needs to be perfectly organized whenever you first start. That the thesis needs to be at the beginning, all the body paragraphs need to be in order, and you need to have a conclusion at the end. But that's not true. Whenever you're drafting, whenever you're working on a first or one of your drafts in progress, you have flexibility. You want to be working on any part that you feel comfortable and confident with. You want to at least get that work out of the way. You can rearrange the body paragraphs later. You may not even know what your thesis statement is right away. You may still be formulating it, but you can get the body paragraphs ready, knowing somewhat of what your thesis is going to be, and then come up with it later. So don't get so stressed about the organization of writing. The main thing is to just start writing. And keep in mind that body paragraphs don't have to be in their final order while drafting. You can write whichever one you want to write first and then come back to the ones that are more challenging later. Begin drafting where the work seems easiest. If there's one topic out of all of your main topics under your thesis that you've been dying to write about that one first. Get your brain juices flowing. If you write about that one, you may think of something else you want to add to the next topic, and that may get you going. But just start writing, right where it seems easiest, and this helps you make immediate progress. You may not have the whole paper done. You may not have it organized just the way you want it. You may not know what your thesis statement is, but you've made some progress. You've written a whole paragraph. One of your body paragraphs is at least written in its first draft. So this is a great boost to your morale. Where you may have been feeling like, oh, I'm never going to get this done. Now you at least have one of your paragraphs done. Or you may even have two if writing the first one got you thinking about what you wanted to say in the second one. And information can just kind of flow like that. You start with one and it just trickles down. You keep thinking about what you're writing and more ideas come to you as you're writing, and you can keep adding it to those body paragraphs. And then eventually, if you haven't done it from the beginning, formulate your thesis statement. So it isn't important to have everything in the right order while you're writing, but at the end, usually, you're going to have a certain order that you want your drafts to be in. So first, you want your thesis, which is your main idea, or the summary of your main idea, and then the rest of that paragraph can expand on your thesis a little bit. And then you want body paragraphs in an order that makes sense. So you may not have had them in this order whenever you first started, but now that you see how your paper has been organized, how it was flowing, you have your body paragraphs in an order that makes sense to what you're writing. And then at the end, you're going to have a conclusion. Now, your draft does not have to be in this order. This is what you're striving for at the very end, but in the pre-drafting period, where you're just working on what you're getting on paper, you're working on each of those body paragraphs individually, not necessarily getting them into the right order. Don't worry about what order they're in. Worry about getting something written down. Work on what seems easiest. Help yourself make some immediate progress. Organizational methods to structure text. Authors organize their writing based on the purpose of their text. And 5 of the main methods that authors use to structure their text are cause and effect, compare and contrast, chronological order, inductive presentation of ideas, and deductive presentation ideas. Cause and effect presents the reasons something happened. For instance, if I said, if you go to bed late, you will be tired. The cause is going to bed late, and the effect is being tired. And a cause and effect piece of writing is going to keep giving you reason something happened and the effect of that particular reason. Compare and contrast writing discusses similarities and differences. It's going to say how two things are alike and how they are different. And these may also come across as pro and con pieces, where it gives you the pros of two things and the cons of two things. An example would be if I said, as a thesis statement, those who are up to date on technology are still debating over whether DVDs or Blu-ray discs are better. Well, the author could go through and describe all the similarities between DVDs and Blu-ray discs and all the differences between DVDs and Blu-ray discs. So, in the end, you could make up your mind which one is better because they're simply comparing and contrasting the two. Chronological order presents information in the order that it happened. It starts at the beginning and works its way to the end. And a good example of chronological order pieces are biographies. You start whenever someone was born, you go through their childhood, adulthood, and events leading up to their death. It happens, the book is laid out to describe events exactly in the order that they happened chronologically in time. Inductive presentation of ideas starts with specific examples and moves to a general conclusion. So if I were to want to convince you that it was good to donate blood, I would start off with lots of specific examples or reasons why it was good to donate blood, and then give you the general conclusion, you should always donate blood. Deductive presentation of ideas is going to be the opposite of that. It starts with the conclusion, you should always donate blood. And then it explains supporting examples. So I would give you examples or reasons that list out the benefits of donating blood. And you can see these two are opposite, so it's important to remember the difference. Inductive is going to list all of them and then take them in a general conclusion at the end. Deductive is kind of, maybe think division. You start with one big conclusion and divide it down into lots of supporting details or examples. So whenever you are trying to organize your own writing or trying to figure out the purpose of an author's writing, try to figure out what the organizational method was, and it might help you figure out the overall purpose of the text.
Organization is very important in a paper because it helps the reader follow the writer's train of thought. So there's several types of organization, and some of those I've written up here on the board. The important thing is that the writer picks a method of organization and sticks with it through the entire paper. So the first method of organization is spatial organization. So say I was describing a room. I would describe everything on the floor, then everything on one wall, and moving clockwise, describe each wall, and then describe the ceiling. I wouldn't describe the couch, and then a painting on one wall, and then a picture on another wall, and then discuss the recliner on the floor. I would focus on one area of the room before moving on to the next area. Another way to organize a paper is through cause and effect. You could talk about something that's going on and the effect of that, or talk about several causes and several effects. You can also compare and contrast. If you're talking about two or more things, talk about how these things are alike and how these things are different. Another way is through chronological order. So you could talk about the series of events. This is great if it's step-by-step instructions. You wouldn't start with something and start talking about it and then say, oh, before you do this, make sure you do this. You would start at the very beginning. Like you were talking about a recipe, you would talk about this is the first ingredient, then the second ingredient, then the third ingredient. So that can be very good. Or if you're talking about someone's life, you would start when they were born and move all the way till where they are currently or until death. If you're talking about a series of events, it's best to give the background information first and work up to today. So chronological order can be a great method of organization. Classification and division. This is like talking about things that are very general and then getting more specific. And then problem and solution. You can talk about a problem and then the solution to that problem or some possible solutions to that problem. So these are just some basic ways to organize a paper. There are other methods out there, and there's some that you can kind of come up with on your own. You wouldn't have to find them. You just naturally know this is the best way to organize my paper. But the important thing is Find one way to organize your paper and stick with it. Don't jump around between the different methods of organization.
Parallelism. Parallelism means writing with a parallel structure. That means all nouns, verbs, and phrases should have the same structure. Let's look at some examples to see what that means. In example 1, John runs fast and plays hard. There we have multiple verbs, runs and plays. So they should be parallel. They should have the same structure. And both runs and plays are simple third person present tense verbs. So they are simple verbs. They don't have any suffixes. They're third person. We're talking about John. You're not saying I did this. You're saying John did this, talking about someone else. And it's present tense. He's running and playing right now. He runs and plays in the present. So they agree. Both runs and plays are simple third person present tense verbs. So they have parallel structure. So this one is good. Let's look at example 2. My hobbies are playing the piano, running marathons, and reading books. So we have 3 phrases there, but they all start with verbs. So let's look at those. Playing the piano, running marathons, reading books. This sentence also has correct verb structure. Playing, running, and reading are all present tense, and they all have ing as a suffix for them. If this sentence didn't have parallel verb structure, it would seem awkward and disjointed. Think about it. If it said, my hobbies are playing the piano, run marathons, and read books, it wouldn't make sense because you've got one with ing, one that's present tense, and one that's past tense. They all have to agree. They all have to have the same structure. They need to be the same tense. They need to be the same, have the same suffix, or all not have a suffix. And all these things are important whenever you're writing a sentence that is more complex than just something with one subject or one noun and one verb. If you have multiple nouns, verbs, or phrases, you need to make sure they have parallel structure. So again, this one was good, but if it wasn't, it wouldn't sound very good. It would sound awkward and disjointed. Let's look at example 3. When we went to the beach, we spent the whole day swimming in the water, building sandcastles, and we took walks on the beach. This one was another one with 3 verb phrases. When we went to the beach, we spent the whole day swimming in the water, building sandcastles, and we took walks along the beach. Swimming and building are both present tense with ing endings, but took is past tense. It does not have the ing, and it makes our sentence sound disjointed. So this one needs to be revised. So let's talk about some ways we can do that. We already have swimming and building, so we could make that last phrase agree with the first one. If we do that, we could say, we spent the whole day swimming in the water, building sandcastles, and taking walks along the beach. And that is one correct way to fix this. Now, that isn't the only way. Let's look at another way, because whenever you're trying to find parallel structure, you don't necessarily have to make it all match the first verb that you come to or the first noun that you come to. You just have to make them all have the same structure. So if we took them all out and we came up with a different way, we could say, when we went to the beach, we're going to take out even more of it to make this one make sense. When we went to the beach, we swam in the water, built sandcastles, and took walks along the beach. So in this one, instead of leaving the first two in the present tense with ing suffix, we changed them all to match that last verb, which was past tense. But we took out having we here because we already had we at the beginning. We didn't need to keep repeating we. We could just make the phrases go after it and have parallel structure so that they made sense. So another way to fix a sentence was to say, when we went to the beach, we swam in the water, built sandcastles, and took walks along the beach. So we changed them all to past tense, and now they match and have parallel structure. So now we've revised it, and it's good. So whenever you're writing, make sure that your writing has parallelism. You want to make sure that all the nouns, verbs, or phrases have the same structure so that your writing makes sense and doesn't sound awkward or disjointed.
Pronoun antecedent agreement.
The antecedent is the word that refers back to the pronoun. And the antecedent must agree with the pronoun in both number and gender. That means if our pronoun is singular, then our antecedent must be singular. And if our pronoun is plural, then our antecedent must be plural. Likewise, if our pronoun is feminine, then our antecedent must be feminine. If our pronoun is masculine, the antecedent must be masculine. Or if it's gender neutral, then we need to have a gender neutral antecedent. So let's look at some examples. He left blank coat at school. Our pronoun is he. He is both masculine and singular, so we need a pronoun that fits that. He left his coat at school. His goes along with he because it is both showing masculinity and singular. They walked blank dog around the block. Our pronoun is they. They is plural and it's gender neutral, so we need an antecedent that will match that. They walked their dog around the block. Their is gender neutral and it is plural, so this antecedent fits the pronoun. She wore a blue dress to blank senior prom. Our pronoun is she, and so we need something feminine and singular. She wore a blue dress to her senior prom. Her is singular and feminine. Let's look at the next one. Everyone must turn in blank homework by 8 o'clock. Our pronoun is everyone, and this one's a little trickier because everyone, while it's talking about multiple people, is actually a singular pronoun. It's considered singular, and it goes with a singular verb. So we need a singular antecedent that is also gender neutral. So in this case, we have to do his or her. We give options so that the gender isn't defined as either his or her, and it is still going to be singular, whether you choose his or her. Picking just one of those will make it a singular antecedent. So everyone is a special pronoun that would go with the antecedent his or her. Did anyone lose blank watch in the parking lot? Our pronoun is anyone. Anyone is singular and it doesn't have any gender with it. So we need a gender neutral singular pronoun. It's kind of similar to everyone. So we can say, did anyone lose his or her watch in the parking lot? And again, it gives options for gender and it shows that it's going to be a singular antecedent once one of those is chosen. If you are asking it and a boy answers, then it would have been his watch in the parking lot. If a girl answers, it would have been her watch in the parking lot. What time did you leave blank house today? Our pronoun is you. So we need a pronoun that goes with you that is gender neutral, and you is kind of tricky as well because it can be singular or it can be plural, but there's a special antecedent that goes with you that will work in both situations. You would say, what time did you leave your house today? So you may be asking a family, what time did you, plural, leave your house today? and one of them could answer. Or you may be asking one person, what time did you specifically leave the house today? And they would tell you what time they left their house. Let's look at the next one. The cat had a bell on blank collar. This one doesn't have a pronoun, but let's look at our noun, cat. Cat is singular, and we don't know if it's a boy or a girl. We don't know if it should be feminine or masculine. So we want to pick an antecedent that would work for either. So you would say the cat had a bell on its collar. Now we could have said it had a bell on its collar, but usually you want to know what you're talking about before you start saying it. So in this case, I put in so you would know what we were talking about. But the cat had a bell on its collar. This is singular, and we don't know the gender, so it's gender neutral. Where did we park blank car? In this sentence, our pronoun is we, and we need an antecedent that goes with we, which is plural, and it is gender neutral. So we're going to say our car. Whenever you use the pronoun we, you can usually use the antecedent our. Where did we put our car? We went to our friend's house for lunch. We is the pronoun, our is the antecedent. And lastly, the children brought blank toys for show and tell. This is another one I didn't put a pronoun in, but we can look at our plural subject here, and it doesn't give us a specific gender, it's just a group. So we need an antecedent that will work with a plural word that is gender neutral. And we will say their. The children brought their toys for show and tell. So whenever you're looking at pronoun antecedent agreement or even noun antecedent agreement, make sure you're paying attention to the number, whether it is a singular or plural pronoun, and the gender, is it singular or masculine, so that you can make sure to choose the correct antecedent to fit the sentence correctly. Rhetorical schemes. Authors use rhetorical schemes to emphasize, draw angles, and engage the reader. Some common rhetorical schemes we have are parallelism, repetition, and antithesis. Now, rhetorical schemes are just devices used to make your writing stronger and more interesting. So these are just a few of many different rhetorical schemes, and if you were interested in more ideas, you could always research and find other rhetorical schemes so that you could make your writing stronger. Parallelism is when several sentences are given the same grammatical structure. An example would be, Hector went to the store. He went to the bank. He went to the gym. The author suggests the dullness of these activities. That parallel structure shows that it's the same thing happening over and over again. It's really dull. It's really boring. He went to the store. He went to the bank. He went to the gym. He was just playing out the monotony of his day. It was dull, and this grammatical structure is supposed to echo the dullness of the story that's being told. Repetition is another example of a rhetorical scheme. Repetition is when you use the same word several times quickly, and the author does this for different reasons. Let's look at an example and then we'll discuss those reasons. They called him a slave. He thought of himself as a slave, and his prospects were no better than those of a slave. This mimics the plodding, hopeless nature of slavery. Think about the way that sounds. It sounds like he's plodding along. They called him a slave, and he thought of himself as a slave, and his prospects were no better than those of a slave. So it's plodding, and the sentence sounds hopeless, and you hear the word slave over and over again. And it causes the reader to focus on that word, slave, and consider whether it is really appropriate. So those are two reasons that a writer may use repetition. It may mimic a certain nature and make you think about that, or it could cause the reader to focus on that word and consider whether it's appropriate or whether it's being used as a literary device. Is this person really a slave, or is it someone that they're just calling a slave as an exaggeration because of the way he's being treated or the way that he's perceived? And we really don't know, based on this one sentence, whether this word is appropriate or not. We would have to see the rest of the paragraph. But it definitely does give us a plodding, hopeless feeling to this sentence. The last rhetorical scheme we're going to discuss is the antithesis, which is using contrary ideas expressed in a balanced sentence. An example would be, one small step for man, one giant leap for all mankind. This is the famous quote. It said after we took our first step on the moon, putting man on the moon was a giant leap for all mankind. But it was just one small step. He took one small step onto the moon, and that one small step counted as a giant leap for all mankind. So you've got those contrary ideas of a small step and a giant leap expressed in a balanced sentence. And you understand what he means. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Being able to step foot on the moon was a huge leap for mankind, even if it was just a small step literally. So this is an example of antithesis. So in your writing, there are several rhetorical schemes that you can use to make your writing stronger and more engaging to the reader.
Subject-verb agreement is essential to making sure that your writing makes sense. So let's look at some examples up here on the board so that you can better understand how to make your subject and your verb agree. See, the main problem that happens when subjects and verbs don't agree is that there's a certain number in the subject, but the verb doesn't agree with that number in the subject. See what I mean here? The flies are everywhere. See, flies is plural, and are is a plural verb as well. So that's why the subject and verb here are going together. So that's a great example of good subject-verb agreement. Now this sentence is talking about one fly. It says the fly is over here. So since fly is singular, the verb needs to be singular. Is a singular verb, so that's why it's used here. See, if we said the fly are over here, that wouldn't make sense. That's why we say the fly is over here. This next sentence says everything is in place. Words like everything or anyone are words that aren't very specific. So for the cases of subject-verb agreement, we consider words that aren't specific as being singular. So even though everything refers to many things, we still treat it as singular, so we use the singular verb is. This next sentence says people are here. So people is plural. It's talking about more than one person. So the verb needs to be plural as well. That's why we use the verb are. There are some sentences where you're going to have two subjects, and one subject may be plural and one subject may be singular. So the question arises, do I use a singular or plural verb? Well, the answer to that question is choose the verb or choose the word that is closest to the verb. So here we say my grandfather or my parents are going to buy a bike for me. So we would say are, because my parents is closest to are, and parents is plural, so we use the plural verb are. See, my grandfather is also a subject in this sentence. Grandfather and parents are both subjects. But grandfather is singular, so it doesn't necessarily agree with this plural verb. However, we have to choose either a singular verb or a plural verb, so it makes the most sense to base the verb off of the subject closest to it. So this sentence is the same sentence up here, just reversed. My parents or my grandfather is going to buy a bike for me. So here, we use the singular form of this verb, is, because grandfather is closest to the verb, and grandfather is singular. Parents, again, is still plural, but it's farther away from the verb than grandfather is. So the important thing is make sure your subject and verb agree in the number they are referring to, and that'll help you make your writing easier to understand on the reader's part. Transitions are very helpful to the reader because they help the reader transition from one thought to another or one concept to another. Transitions can be placed at the beginning of a sentence or in the middle of a sentence, either to help the reader transition from one sentence to another or from one part of the sentence to another part of the sentence. So I want to take a look at many different kinds of transition words and phrases that can be used and how they can be used accurately in sentences. So first of all, transitions can be broken up into different kinds of transitions. So some transitions show addition, like the transitions next and in addition. Remember I said that we can also have transition phrases, and so this is a prepositional phrase acting as a transition. Another type of transition is a summary, like in conclusion or finally. And there's some transitions that show sequence, like later or then. And then finally, some transitions show contrast, like although or meanwhile. So how can you effectively use these transitions in sentences? Many times the transition word or transition phrase needs to go at the beginning of the sentence. Like here, this sentence says, next, bake the cookies for 10 minutes. So we put the transition at the beginning of the sentence and put a comma after it. Now, generally, commas come in pairs in sentences when they are showing that a certain part of the sentence isn't needed. So notice here that next could be removed from the sentence, and we could just read the sentence like this, bake the cookies for 10 minutes, and it would still make sense. So usually when you have some kind of phrase or word that could be omitted from the sentence, you put commas on both sides of it. Like here's part of a sentence, then there's a comma, here's the part of the sentence that isn't needed, another comma, and then the rest of the sentence. But when a word or phrase comes at the beginning or the end of a sentence, you only need one comma, because you wouldn't put a comma before next. That would look funny, so you just put a comma after it to show that next isn't there. So although next isn't essential to the sentence, it's helpful because it helps the reader understand the transition from one thought to another. In this case, the next step in directions on how to bake cookies. All right, this next sentence says, although I enjoy the outdoors, I do not like to run. Although is a transition that shows contrast. And notice here there's not a comma right after although. It's placed after outdoors. But again, although I enjoy the outdoors could be removed from the sentence, and it would still make sense. It would just say, I do not like to run. Nevertheless, this part of the sentence is still important to the overall paper. Now, notice that in certain cases, you have to continue the sentence for it to make sense. Like here, it wouldn't matter whether next was here or not. But since you've put although right here, you have to finish the sentence. You couldn't say, although I enjoy the outdoors. Because I enjoy the outdoors makes sense by itself, but once you add although to it, you're telling the reader that there's something else that needs to come. So after you put, although I enjoy the outdoors, you have to put, I do not like to run to finish out the sentence. So the things that are important to remember from this session is that there are many different kinds of transitions that can be classified into different categories. And there's many more categories we could have listed and many more transitions we could have listed under each category. And then generally, the transition word or phrase is going to go at the beginning of the sentence. And in this case, where there's a phrase at the beginning of the sentence that is started off by a transition word, make sure you finish the sentence and don't leave the reader hanging by writing a fragment. Transitions are very important in your writing because it helps the author understand what you are trying to convey. In short, transitions provide a smooth flow from one paragraph, idea, or sentence to another. Oftentimes, if you have two paragraphs, it is awkward to start another paragraph without acknowledging the previous one. So transitions make that exchange less awkward. Sometimes you'll have two ideas within a paragraph. It can become unclear to the reader when one idea ends and when another starts unless you have a transition. And then sometimes within a concept or idea in a paragraph, you will have several sentences. Transitions help the flow from one sentence to the next be less awkward as well. Transitions also show how things are related. Many times your essay can appear to have many good ideas in it, but the reader is having trouble drawing connections and seeing how those ideas and concepts are interrelated. Transitions help you do that. There are many different types of transitions, and each has different uses. So if you're restating something, you can use a transition like namely, or in other words. And if you're contrasting something, you can use a transition like nevertheless, or rather. And if you're using directions, you can use a transition like to the left, or below. The important thing is to remember, if in doubt, use a transition in your writing so that the reader can understand what you are trying to convey. It's very important that writers trim their writing as much as possible. The more concise their writing, the better, because it makes it easier for the reader to understand what they are trying to say. Take a look at this first sentence. A bike that belongs to Anne is in the garage. The writer of this sentence is able to express accurately what they want to say. However, their sentence could be trimmed down a little bit because there are extra words in this sentence. So by making Anne possessive, this sentence could be shortened by quite a bit. Anne's bike is in the garage. So notice what I did here. Just by adding an apostrophe S to Anne, I was able to shorten the sentence by quite a bit, trimming this sentence up and making it more concise. There are also prepositional phrases that writers often use that aren't needed. One of those is, in my opinion. A writer will often start off a sentence by saying, in my opinion. However, this isn't really needed because anyone who is reading something knows that it's the writer's opinion, so the writer doesn't need to tell the reader that it's in their opinion. So oftentimes a prepositional phrase like this can just be removed from the sentence and the sentence will still make sense and it'll be a little bit more concise and easier for the reader to understand. There are also phrases that writers often use that are a little bit too wordy. Some of those include refer back or end result. In both of these cases, these phrases could be shortened to one word. If you look at refer and back, it's meaning the same thing. To refer to something means to go back to something. So either word here could be eliminated and there would still be the same meaning. The same thing with end result. End and the result mean the same thing. So if we eliminate end, result is the same thing. End result is no different than just saying result. So if you can say something in less words, always try to say it in as few words as possible. There are also some words that are overused, like very and extremely. Very and extremely don't really have much meaning on their own. So if you overuse them, they have even less meaning. So it's important to use words like very and extremely sparingly. Take a look at these two sentences. I am very elated. I am very happy. Elated simply means extremely happy. So to say I am very extremely happy doesn't really make sense because someone can't really be more happy than elated. So very could be removed from this sentence. I am elated. Now in this sentence, very plays more of an important role because if someone was just to say I am happy, the reader doesn't really know how happy the writer is. But by inserting the word very, the reader now knows that the author is very happy. So sometimes very and extremely and other words of that nature do have a place and they are important, but many times they can be eliminated. So as a writer, always be looking for places to trim your work. Be looking for words that can be eliminated. Be looking for prepositional phrases that can be removed from the sentence. And even look for sentences that can be removed from the paragraphs that aren't needed. The 5-part essay is an effective way to convey an argument to the reader or persuade the reader to take a certain action. There's 2 main ways to do a 5-part essay, so let's take a look at those ways. First way, you're going to start out with an introduction. In the introduction, you're going to have your thesis statement, which is basically explaining what your essay is going to be about. The rest of the essay is going to further explain that thesis statement. Then the second section is the narrational. In the narrational, you're going to give the reader some background information, some additional information to help them understand your thesis statement better. Then you have the affirmation. In the affirmation, you're going to give facts, data, and details that are in support of your thesis statement. So anything that supports your thesis statement, you're going to put in the affirmation. Then you have the negation. This is where you put forth arguments that are against your thesis statement. And when you present an argument against your thesis statement, you can do one of 2 things. One, you can offer a rebuttal that takes away the credibility of the argument, or you can just concede and say, I understand this argument is a very good one, and it may very well be true. Then you're going to have the conclusion. This is basically a lot like the introduction. You're going to have the thesis statement again, maybe worded a little bit differently, and you're going to tell the reader what you told them. You're going to kind of wrap it up. Now, the second way to do this is, again, you're going to start with the introduction, have the thesis statement in the introduction. Now, in this way of doing the 5-part essay is, instead of having the 3 different type of body paragraphs or body sections, this is the body, here you're going to have basically a 3-part thesis statement. The thesis statement is going to have 3 main facets to it. So in each paragraph, you're going to explain a different facet of the thesis statement. So if the thesis statement lists 3 main arguments, in this paragraph, you're going to talk about the first argument. This paragraph, you're going to talk about the second argument. And in this paragraph, you're going to talk about the third argument. Then the conclusion basically sums up the points and restates the thesis, but restates it maybe a little bit differently, not word for word. Now, this differs from a 5-paragraph essay in that in a 5-paragraph essay, it's just what it sounds like, 5 paragraphs. The introduction's 1 paragraph, the body paragraphs take up 3 paragraphs, and then the conclusion is 1 paragraph. So the whole essay is 5 paragraphs. Where in this case, in the 5-part essay, each of these points merely indicates a section of the essay. So the introduction could be several paragraphs, depending on how much information you have. Or the affirmation. If you have a lot of good information supporting your thesis, you could put several paragraphs for your affirmation. And finally, a good way to remember how to set up a 5-part essay is, first, you're going to tell them what you're going to tell them. That's the introduction. Then you're going to tell them, and that would be in the 3 middle sections. And then finally, for the conclusion, you're going to tell them what you told them. ACT English Strategy. I want to go over 4 methods to obtain coherence in writing. So when I talk about coherence, I'm talking mainly about consistency. And so one method is by the repetition of key phrases or words. And so when you repeat key phrases or words, you are establishing consistency in your writing, because the reader can see your consistency because you're using the same phrases and words over and over. A second method is the use of personal pronouns. So this sentence says, Joe's dog walked around Joe's leg. Now, Joe's right here that's underlined is the only one that should remain. We should remove Joe's right here and replace it with his, because when we use Joe's twice, it begins to confuse the reader because they think we're talking about more than one Joe. And so by using this personal pronoun right here of his, it increases the comprehension on the reader's part, which in turn increases coherence. Because even if you have consistency in your writing, if the reader can't comprehend what you're writing, they're not going to be able to see the consistency in your writing. A third method is the use of synonyms. So this first sentence says, he went on a hike with his colleague. Now, say you don't know what the word colleague means. Well, you progress to the next sentence and read, it was his first time to hang out with a coworker. So you can easily see that colleague and coworker are indeed synonyms. And so if you did not know what colleague meant, you probably know what coworker means. And so you can just figure out what colleague means by saying that it's a synonym with coworker. And so again, this increases comprehension, which helps for consistency. Now, the fourth method is the use of parallel construction. And so parallel construction is when you have items in a series and you approach each item in the series the same way. And so this sentence says, I went to the grocery store, the car wash, and ate lunch at the food court. And so each item in this series does not have the same grammatical setup. See, you should be able to apply the first 3 words of this sentence to each part of the series. You should be able to say, I went to the grocery store, which you can, as well as I went to the car wash, and then I went to ate lunch at the food court. See, the first 2 parts of this series make sense, but the third part doesn't. You have to rephrase this sentence for it to make more sense. You can say, I went to the grocery store, the car wash, and to the food court to eat lunch. And so those are 4 methods to obtain coherence in your writing. An outline is a quick way to organize information. So up here on the board, we have an outline. So next to Roman numeral 1, you put the main idea of a story. So that needs to be a complete sentence. So say I'm making an outline about a story that I read about the importance of drinking water. So now I want to make an outline about the importance of drinking water. So my main point is going to be water is a better choice than soda. So now we come to A. So this is a supporting detail. So I would say supporting detail number 1, health. So I'm going to talk about the health benefits of drinking water. So notice here then we have subpoints. So I do my first subpoint where I talk about cavities. All the sugar in soda contributes to people having cavities on their teeth. And then the second subpoint is going to be about obesity. Many times people who drink soda get overweight because soda is so unhealthy. So now we go to our second supporting detail. So now we're no longer talking about health, we're talking about this second supporting detail, which in this case is the fact that water is more reasonable than soda. And so the first supporting detail of this supporting detail, or the first subpoint, is the cost. Water is a lot cheaper than soda. This is true if you're drinking water out of the faucet at home rather than buying soda, or if you drink water at restaurants rather than buying soda. It's a lot cheaper. And then the second subpoint is soda is harder to find. For example, if you're about to eat dinner at your house and you want a soda, you may be out of soda, so you have to go to the store. Might have to make a special trip. Whereas water is going to be available pretty much wherever you are. So if you make it a point to drink water, you'll find it very easy to always have water. And so then, if I wanted to, I could have a third supporting detail. I don't want to. Or I could actually have more subpoints than this. Say up here I wanted to talk about other health reasons to drink water. I could have kept going with the subpoints all the way to 5, 6, 7 subpoints. So this right here is just the main way that you would want to do an outline. But you can do it a lot of different ways. So now I'm going to do the conclusion. So I'm going to put it next to Roman numeral 2. So my conclusion is going to be drinking water benefits your health and lifestyle. So this is basically a summary of the story that I read about why water is a better choice than soda. So the idea of an outline is to not tell everything that you found out from the story. It's just a quick way to organize information from a story or paper. So say, for example, I wanted to make this as I was reading the story. I could read the first line of the story, which says water is a better choice than soda. So I write that down as my main idea. And then it begins to make its first point. So I write, okay, health reasons. And then I just go through this as I'm reading it so that by the time I finish with the story, I have notes from the story. So I can look back at my notes and remember what I read. So remember that there's many different ways to do an outline, but this is just the general way to do an outline. Some stories are written in personal voice. And so personal voice is when you hear the author's viewpoint. So the story is written from the mind of the author. So many times when you read a story, it would say, Emily washed her dog. Well, when you're reading something in personal voice, it would say, I washed my dog. And that's because the author is writing a story about themselves. And so let's go ahead and read this story right here and study it. It was Saturday morning and I could not wait to finally get outside. My family and I ate pancakes together. Since I had eaten my favorite breakfast, I felt energized. My son weeded the garden while I trimmed the bushes. So we have this story right here written in personal voice. The author wrote it about themselves. Now, the voice here, the personal voice, helps the reader understand the author because the author tells us things about themselves. And it also gives us clues about them. And so we can learn from that. And so a personal voice makes the story more interesting. The personal voice tells how an author feels about what is happening. So we need to study this to figure out things about the author. It says it was Saturday morning and I could not wait to finally get outside. Well, since it says I could not wait to finally get outside, it sounds like this person doesn't get outside much. So we can conclude then that this person is in an office all week, or they do something inside for their job. And then it says, my family and I ate pancakes together. So this shows that the author has a family and that possibly they eat breakfast a lot together on Saturday morning. And then it says, since I'd eaten my favorite breakfast, I felt energized. Well, remember, it says here that they ate pancakes. So now we know that pancakes is the author's favorite breakfast. And then it says, my son weeded the garden while I trimmed the bushes. So there's lots of things we can learn about this author just from a few sentences. So you really have to study everything you read to figure out things about the author. ACT, English sentence structure. There are 3 verb tenses that I want to take a look at. And those verb tenses are present perfect, past perfect, and future perfect. So the present perfect is used to emphasize the completion of an action in the very recent past. So here's an example. I have just purchased a necklace. So this is something that was completed in the very recent past. It was just completed. Person just purchased a necklace. Now, the present perfect can also be used to indicate an action begun in the past and continued to the present moment. So here's an example of that. Sam has lived in the same house for 10 years. So this is talking about something that is happening now and may have happened for a long time, but the reason we're still calling it the present perfect is because it's coming up all the way till the present. And then we have the past perfect, which indicates how 2 finished actions are related in time. So the example here is before he went blind, Milton had written Paradise Lost. So we're looking at 2 actions here, Milton going blind and Milton writing Paradise Lost. Both of these are finished actions. And so this sentence is showing that Milton wrote Paradise Lost before he went blind. So here, the first completed action is using the past perfect, while the second action is using the simple past. And then we come to future perfect, which indicates an action to be finished before a future time. So the example for that is, I will have finished the book before I take the exam. So this is an action that has not happened yet, but is going to eventually be finished. And the sentence is telling the reader before what event that action is going to be completed. See, the writer is saying they're going to finish the book before the event of taking the exam. So that's a look at present perfect, past perfect, and future perfect verb tenses. Parallel construction is an important concept for writers to understand. Basically, the concept of parallel construction is that each part of a sentence should be grammatically structured the same as the other parts of that sentence. Take a look at this sentence so you can see what I mean. I have a dog, a cat, and fish. So what's wrong with this sentence? This sentence may seem correct to you. But notice how the word is before dog, the word is before cat, but the word is not before fish. Here we have 3 items in a list. So each item should be grammatically constructed the same as the other parts of the sentence. So here, since the word is before dog and the word is before cat, the word should be before fish. So if we insert here, the sentence is now correct. I have a dog, a cat, and a fish. So sometimes the concept of parallel construction applies to when you have 3 or 4 items in a list, but sometimes it just applies when you have 2 parts to a sentence. See what I mean here? He gave me money for clothes, not food. Again, this sentence may seem grammatically correct to you because you may have seen people write like this, or you may have even heard people talk like this. However, this sentence is not grammatically constructed correctly. Because see here, the word for is before clothes. However, the word for is not before food. So to make this correct, the word for needs to be inserted before food. So now the sentence reads, he gave me money for clothes, not for food. So now that sentence sounds more correct. It sounds more complete. So the important thing to remember about parallel construction is that you're striving as a writer to make each part of a sentence or each item in a list constructed the same as the other parts or the other items in that sentence. A thesis statement is a very important part of a paper because it basically tells the reader what your paper is going to be about. And every part of your paper has to go along with the thesis statement. So consider your thesis statement as an umbrella. So here's the umbrella, and so all of your points have to fit in under the umbrella. Point 1 has to, and point 2. And if any point tries to get out here and doesn't quite fit under the thesis statement and doesn't quite talk about the same things as the thesis statement, you have two choices. You can expand your umbrella. In other words, expand your thesis statement to include point 3, or you just have to remove point 3 and not talk about that point. But the important thing is that everything in your paper refers back to your thesis statement. It's the guide for your whole paper. It's what holds it together, because otherwise you have a paper with lots of different concepts, and the thesis statement is the unifying sentence of the paper that brings it all together. The thesis statement needs to go near the beginning of the paper. Now notice I said near the beginning, not at the very beginning. Generally, it needs to be the last sentence of the first paragraph. So you put in your paper some introductory information, and then you close off the paragraph with the thesis statement, which lets the reader know what the paper is going to be about. And then at various times throughout the paper, you may repeat the thesis statement just in slightly different form, especially in the conclusion of the paper. So a good thesis statement tells what the paper is going to be about, and generally is pretty specific. It's not very broad. It tells the reader almost exactly what the paper is going to be dealing with. So those are some important things to remember when using thesis statements. ACT, English sentence structure. A sentence can be identified according to its structure. So the 4 different types of structures are simple sentence, compound sentence, complex sentence, and compound complex sentence. So a simple sentence is made up of just an independent clause. An independent clause is a clause that can stand by itself. So here's an example. It rained yesterday. So we have a subject here, it, and a verb, rained. And so this sentence isn't dependent on anything else to be a complete sentence. It's a sentence in its own right because it can stand alone. It rained yesterday is a grammatically correct sentence. So we call that an independent clause. Now, a compound sentence is made up of 2 or more independent clauses. Now, I'm just going to write here IC for independent clause. And so an example of a compound sentence is she likes to eat fruit and I like to eat vegetables. So notice here that we have a subject and a verb. She likes to eat fruit, and a subject and a verb. I like to eat vegetables. So this is an independent sentence because it could be a sentence by itself, and this is an independent sentence because we could just say I like to eat vegetables, and that's a sentence by itself. But notice here we have them joined together by a comma and the conjunction and. And so there's a few ways you can join 2 independent clauses together. One is by that example right there, by a comma and a conjunction. And so and is a conjunction as well as words like for, but, so, and yet. And then we can also join 2 independent clauses by just a semicolon. So right here we could take out the comma and just put a semicolon. It's less common, but it's still grammatically correct. And another way is just to put a conjunction with no comma. Now that wouldn't really be grammatically correct in this sentence right here, but I'm going to show you a sentence in a little bit where this would be appropriate. You only need to do that when you have 2 short independent clauses being joined together. Now the third sentence structure is a complex sentence. It has 1 independent clause and at least 1 dependent clause. So I'm going to write here independent clause and at least 1 dependent clause. So an example of that is, because I like to drink milk, my bones are very strong. Now here you see the subject I and the verb like. So you have I like to drink milk. You have a subject and a verb, but this is not a complete sentence. This is a dependent clause because of this word right here, because. If you were to say, because I like to drink milk, that wouldn't be a complete sentence. You need something else to it to finish it out. So that's why we call this a dependent clause, because it's dependent on another clause to be complete. Now here, on the other side of this comma, we have an independent clause. Here we have a subject, bones, and a verb, are. So my bones are very strong, can stand alone. So it's joined together with this dependent clause with a comma. Now, dependent clauses can also come after the independent clause, and you could have more than one dependent clause in a complex sentence. Now, a dependent clause is usually introduced by a relative pronoun, such as who, which, that, or something else like that. Or a subordinating conjunction, maybe like although, because, or when. Now finally, we get to the fourth sentence structure, which is a compound complex sentence, which is two or more independent clauses plus one or more dependent clauses. So we have two independent clauses and at least one dependent clause. And so an example of that is the plane arrived and we took off because we were already late. So right here we have plane as the subject and arrived as the verb. And then here we have we as the subject and took as the verb. So this is an independent clause right here because it can stand alone. And this is an independent clause. Now right here we have a dependent clause. Now again, we have a subject and we have a verb. We and were are the subject and verb here, but this is not an independent clause. If we were to take the word because off, it would be an independent clause. We were already late. But because of the word because, it's now a dependent clause. Now right here you may be thinking, we have two independent clauses here joined by just a conjunction and no comma, because what you're used to seeing is a comma right here, which that is appropriate. We could also just put a semicolon right here. That would also be appropriate to join the two independent clauses. But we can actually not use a semicolon and we can not use a comma and just have a conjunction, because this is one of the cases where, like I was saying earlier, you just need a conjunction because you have two short independent clauses. So again, the four sentence structure types are the simple sentence, the compound sentence, the complex sentence, and the compound complex sentence. Text structure is basically the way that descriptions are organized. So we're going to take a look at a few different text structures. So the first is cause and effect. Basically what happens here is one event leads to another. So here it says Abigail did not wipe her feet, so she got mud on the carpet. So we have the cause, which is Abigail did not wipe her feet, and the effect of that is she got mud on the carpet. So one event, the event of her not wiping her feet, leads to another event, in this case, her getting mud on the carpet. And so cause and effect is a very common way to order information because it tells you what happened first, and then it tells you what happened as a result of that. Now, a second type of text structure is chronological order. And so this goes from the past, many times, to the present. Or we could say it this way, it gives you an order of events. It says, I got in the car, drove to the store, and bought oranges. Now, the writer of this wouldn't say they drove to the store, bought oranges, got in the car. Because what had to happen here is first the person got in the car, then they drove to the store, and then they bought oranges. If you mix it up, it confuses the reader. So the idea of text structures is to make your writing very clear. And so chronological order helps the author make themselves very clear because it tells each event as it happened. And then we have spatial order. This isn't quite as common, but it's the way things are placed in an area. So the example I have here is the room has tall ceilings, walls covered with beautiful paintings, elaborate furniture, and wood floors. So spatial order never jumps around. It goes in a very clear way. There's a very clear progression to it. So first it talks about the ceiling. So if you walk into a room, you look up and you see it has tall ceilings. And then you look at all the walls and you notice the elaborate paintings. And then your eyes go down a little bit further and you notice the elaborate furniture. And then finally you look all the way down to the ground and you see the wood floors. Now, there's not really one right way to do spatial order. We could have started the other way. We could have looked at the wood floors, the furniture, the paintings, and then the ceilings. But the point here is have some clear progression to your ideas. Maybe you have a table of people sitting down. And you're talking about each person at the table. You wouldn't jump around all over the table. You'd go in a circle talking about each person at the table. You're doing the same thing here. You shouldn't talk about the ceilings, then talk about the floor, and then talk about the walls, and then talk about what's sitting on the floor. You should have a very clear progression to everything that you're talking about. So once again, cause and effect, chronological order, and spatial order are all text structures. Now there are other text structures, but these are some of the most common. ACT, English sentence structure. Adjectives can be used to compare people, places, or things different in degree. So if you have a one-syllable adjective, you use the suffix er or s, or the words in front of it less or least. So say we have the word new, and then we want to make the comparative form of new. We add the suffix er to make it newer. And if we're trying to compare it with 3 or more objects, then we would put est as the suffix to make it newest. So that's the superlative form. So say you have one car and it's only a month old. You would say you have a new car. Now, if you have a car that's 1 month old and another car that's 2 months old, you would say that the 1 month old car is the newer car. Now, if you're dealing with 3 cars, one's a month old, one's 2 months old, and the other one's 3 months old, you would refer to the car that's a month old as the newest car. Now, this is in the positive sense, whichever one is newer. Now, if we're looking at this more in the negative sense, we could say the comparative form would be less new, and the superlative form would be the least new. So if you have 2 cars, again, you would refer to the one that's 2 months old, the older car, as being less new. And you would refer to the oldest car, if you have 3 or more cars, as being the least new. Now, if you have a 2-syllable adjective ending in y, you use the suffix er or est, or you use the words less or least. So say you have the word hungry, you're going to drop the y and change it to I and add er. So change the y to I and add er, so you get hungrier. It's similar with the superlative form. You change the y to I and add est, so you have hungriest. So if you have one person, you would describe them as hungry. With 2 people, you would describe one person as being hungrier, or describe the other person as being less hungry. If you have 3 or more, you would describe one person as being the hungriest, or you would describe someone as being the least hungry. Now, if you have a word with 2 or more syllables, use more or most, or less or least. So notice here we're no longer using suffixes. So if something is thrilling and you're comparing it with something else, you would say that one is more thrilling. And then if you have 3 or more, you would describe something as being the most thrilling. And then in the same way as before, you would describe one as being less thrilling or the least thrilling. So say you have one amusement park ride somewhere. You would describe it as thrilling. But if you're dealing with 2 rides, you would describe one as being more thrilling. But if you have a whole amusement park full of rides, you would describe one as being the most thrilling. Now, there are some words that we call irregular. And they're irregular in the way that we form their comparative and superlative. A great example of that is the word bad. The comparative form is worse than, which isn't even another form of bad. And then the superlative form is the worst. So that's a look at unequal comparison adjectives. It is important to use different types of sentences. Using different types of sentences adds variety to your writing. So by using different types of sentences, you make your writing more interesting. It's more appealing to the reader. So there's 3 types of sentences. There's the simple sentence, complex sentence, and the compound sentence. So you want to try to use all types of sentences in your writing. So a simple sentence is just a subject and a verb. This is what we'd call one independent clause. Hannah ran through the meadow. So we have the subject here, and we have the verb ran. And so that's all that's here. It's just a complete thought. It's enough to be a sentence, but it's not anything more. Then we have a complex sentence, which is an independent and a dependent clause. So I call this an independent clause because it can stand alone. It has a subject and a verb, so it's a sentence. It doesn't need anything else to make it more of a sentence. And so this says, instead of watching a movie, he read a book. So here we have a subject, he, and a verb, read. Now, he read a book could be a sentence alone. So that's the independent clause. The dependent clause is instead of watching a movie. Because instead of watching a movie isn't a sentence. I couldn't just come up to you and say, instead of watching a movie, you'd be thinking, okay, instead of watching a movie, what are you going to do? So this is the dependent clause. So together, the independent clause and the dependent clause form a complex sentence. And then we have a compound sentence, which is two independent clauses. So here we have the sentence, we ate burgers. So we have the subject we and the verb ate. And then we ate burgers, or then we ate dessert. So we have we as the subject and ate as the verb again. But these are two sentences. These are two independent clauses because both of these clauses could be sentences by themselves. I could come up to you and say, we ate burgers, and that would be a complete thought. Or I could say, then we ate dessert. That would be a complete thought. So by joining these two together, we're forming one sentence, but we're forming one sentence out of what could be two sentences. So that's two independent clauses, which makes a compound sentence. So when you use all of these, it gives your writing variety. It makes your writing more interesting. And also, by using different types of sentences, it makes your sentence length differ as well. So generally, your simple sentences are going to be kind of short, and sometimes your complex or compound sentences will be pretty long. And so by having different lengths to your sentences, it makes your writing more interesting.